2005, I started working at a local social service agency that provided basic needs to our clients, such as housing, food, medical care. And it was here that I unknowingly at the time met the person who would change my life. I first met Frankie following a very contentious phone conversation where it ended with them hanging up the phone on me. They arrived the next day unexpectedly, and the moment that we locked eyes, I knew we were going to be okay. Frankie was about 6 foot tall, had these long, lean legs, shoulder-length blonde hair that was pulled back at the time with a few pieces hanging in the front, covering up pale blue eyeshadow. We engaged in small talk, and Frankie followed me back to my office as I reviewed previous documentation and notes. And I recall a moment of feeling confused. Based on the papers that I was looking at and reading, Frankie was male. However, the person in front of me was presenting as traditionally female. In my efforts to be a good social worker, I said, "Hey, Frankie, how should I document or talk about you in documentation?" And Frankie said, "It doesn't matter." Convinced that I had been unclear, I reframed my question and this time offered gender pronouns, so he and she, him or her. And Frankie then said, "It really doesn't matter to me. Do whatever works for you." And I got stuck. Nothing worked for me because I needed Frankie to pick a box. I was faced with something that I had never at that time experienced, which was a person in front of me who was not clearly identifying as male or female. I needed Frankie to pick a box, and there was not a box for Frankie to check. I didn't know how to talk that way. From that day forward, I had to learn a whole new system of language, a new way of talking about people, and a new way of accepting people just as they are right in front of me. This was my issue. Frankie was fine. As a social worker and working with people, I often wonder what was going on during their childhood that led them to need services from me or my colleagues just to meet their basic needs. I wonder what unmet needs were there. Did they not get love or kindness or compassion? The reason for Frankie and I knowing each other had nothing to do with gender identity. With this in mind, I turned my professional attention towards working with youth and adolescents. Also around this time, I began to build relationships in my community and accepted an appointment to a board of directors for a statewide transgender education and advocacy organization. As part of my board service, I started the first known group in the state of Ohio for transgender and gender non-conforming youth ages 5 to 11. The youngest youth that I work with currently is 4.5. And there are a couple of youth that I work with who've been with me since they were 4. They are now 8 years old. The youth in my group do tremendous work. We talk about relationship building, peer relationships, we engage in role playing, we do artwork, and sometimes we talk about gender identity. We talk about typical childhood issues, and the thing that continues to come up is what it feels like to live as if you're keeping a secret and hiding something. So then we talk about dishonesty versus needing privacy. I've watched the members of this small community grow from being ashamed and confused to standing a little taller and becoming advocates for themselves within their families and within their schools. They want teachers to know that forcing them to choose a girl line or a boy line is often confusing and embarrassing. They want to be able to participate in groups and activities that align with what they like and how they see themselves, not how other people view them. And they want clothing and toy options that are not expressly boy or girl. Engaging in this work led me to think about what we can do to have this conversation on a larger spectrum. It caused me to ask myself, what can I do to make room for these diverse expressions of gender. As youth grow up, we give them messages of empowerment. We tell them to be unique, to be themselves. We say, you can do anything you want to do. You can be a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, an artist. You can go to college. You can change the world. My own parents indulge in my own form of self-expression, and if you remember the 80s, you will appreciate their tolerance for my expression. We give these messages to our youth and to our kids. But for transgender and gender non-conforming youth, there comes a time when these messages stop. These messages stop when us, the adults, those in society, no longer have room for their form of uniqueness or diversity. We make room for people of color. We make room for different languages. We make room for size diversity for those who are differently abled. But we don't make room for transgender and gender nonconforming youth, and we certainly are not making room for transgender women of color. Violence against transgender women of color is growing at alarming rates. Just this 5th month in 2015, there have been 8 known murders of transgender women of color. In 2013, 72% of anti-LGBTQ homicides were against transgender people, and 89% of those were people of color. Tiffany Edwards, 28 years old, lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. She was shot to death and left to die in the middle of the street. Her body was found by a sanitation worker the next morning. Brittany Nicole Kidd Sturgis was 22 years old, lived in Cleveland, Ohio. She was also shot to death, however, she was allowed to die in her car. Samia CC Dove was 20 years old and lived in Olmsted Township, Ohio. Her body was found 3 months following her murder at the bottom of a river with a rope tied around her waist attached to a concrete block and a steel pipe. When the local news reported the homicide, they used her given name, and they used phrases such as oddly dressed man or man in women's clothing. There were no choices for Cece, and there were no messages of empowerment for Brittany or Tiffany. Trans identities give us an opportunity to review everything we think we know about life, about our faith or religion, and about our own selves. These women lived in Ohio. This is happening in our backyard, and as a community, we need to find a way to make space so that all women can be safe. With every opportunity, we get choices. We can choose to turn our backs to an opportunity and to walk away from it, or we can choose to embrace the experience and make room for the diversity that will add to our lives. For me, in choosing to embrace the experience, I also found compassion. My compassion for the experience of another that is different than mine allowed me to make room for them in my lives. And now they are a part of my community, and they are a part of my own story. My compassion is not pity. Yes, I know that there are unmet needs, and I know that people are hurting and they are isolated, but I do not feel pity. We don't have to understand an experience to build compassion. My own compassion has allowed me and encouraged me to embrace my full self. And in that, I am empowering the youth that I work with and my own children. Compassion in action looks different for everyone, but it's a choice that we can make daily. The word itself means joined together with, living together with, not instead of, not outside of, not away from, but with. I'm confident that the youth I work with are going to be okay. They have the benefit of supportive families and a community that will hold them and guide them. They have the benefit of there being room enough in a bubble to keep them safe. But I can't help but be mindful of what happens to those transgender and gender nonconforming youth and young adults and transgender women of color for whose uniqueness and diversity is not a form of empowerment. Rather, it is the very thing that places their lives in danger. For them, may we all choose compassion.